All right, this is take two of Civics in Action with Mr. McGravy. AP students, I'm very, very pleased to have State Representative Andy Vargas with us. Representative Vargas, how are you?
I'm well, thank you, Mr. McGravy, and hello to all your students. It's great to be here with you guys.
It's great to see you. So my student audience that don't know you are a representative from Haverhill. You are the co-author of the Civics bill, which was signed into law by Governor Baker. And you also recently wrote a bill that students and I were talking about H.720, which is lowering the voting age, which we will talk about later. Representative Vargas, I'd just like to start out by asking you, how are you? How are you working from home today, State House other days? Do you want to just fill us in, please?
Sure, yeah, and it's a little bit grainy again, Pat, but we'll work through it and do our best. So during the pandemic, we've been primarily working from home, and the legislation that has been passed through what's called informal sessions, where you don't need to have all the members present in the body, but all it takes is one member to object or oppose a piece of legislation to prevent it from moving forward. And luckily, there have been a couple of key pieces of legislation that we've gotten done during this time in informal session. One of those bills was a housing and evictions bill that we passed, for example. But the majority of the work during this pandemic has really been constituent services. It's picking up the phone when somebody calls and making sure that we're connecting them to the resources that they need, whether that's unemployment, SNAP, food stamps, access to food pantries. There's a lot of constituent services right now, and that's been the bulk of our time. We have about 100 or more open or pending constituent cases right now, and that doesn't count the ones that we've already resolved. So it's certainly been an uptick in work despite working from home. I've been out in the community delivering masks and food as well. We've delivered about 4,500 masks at this point. So there's been a lot of work that we've been doing on the ground, but it's just really been inspirational to see how the community has responded all together.
That's great. And Representative Vargas, are you home, you and your wife? Is that it for your household?
Yes, just me and my wife, yep.
And is she working from home too, or is she essential, or?
Yeah, luckily she's working from home as well. She's a graduate assistant at Boston College, and so she's able to work from home with that job.
Great. And one of the other bills that I think would definitely be of note to my kids is the bill that I believe the DESE commissioner asked about in terms of MCAS.
Yep.
And do you, before we move on to the next category, I think that is a very important issue to my students. Yep. Can you give us a little insider knowledge of what that was like? Was it open and closed? Was it a debate? How did that go?
Sure. So I think this is a good issue to sort of talk about the different levels of government, right? We deal with the federal government, the state government, and the local government. At the local level is, there's schools, parents, teachers, administrators, school committee members, and superintendents that have to implement all the stuff that we pass at the state or at the federal level. At the state level, we have our own sort of state guidelines and regulations and legislation, but then ultimately there's also federal law related to education and federal guidance. And some of that guidance does relate to MCAS and relates to testing requirements that the federal Department of Education is expecting. And so in order for the state to waive MCAS, we had to get what's called a waiver from the federal government to be able to do that here in Massachusetts. And so I know that the commissioner had been in conversation with many stakeholders on that. Several of us legislators wanted to put off MCAS because we found it really unreasonable to be able to expect students to take this up even remotely or electronically. And luckily, working together with the federal government, state government, and most importantly, local government and students and teachers and parents themselves that had reached out, all of those layers working together, we were able to get it done.
Great, excellent, thank you. So you talked a little bit about delivering masks and seeing people out there during this COVID crisis. So just to kind of talk about that a little bit, in your opinion, just in what you've seen in the past a little bit over a month now, what is the impact of COVID-19, the pandemic, on Massachusetts and local communities like North Andover and Haverhill, where you're from? What impact are you seeing?
Well, there's sort of two broad buckets. One is the public health impact, so the actual health of people in our community, the status of our hospitals, what is our hospital capacity at, and then there's the economic sort of impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. On the health front, you may have all heard the term flattening the curve and trying to get the curve or the number of people that actually have are carrying COVID to actually be flattened so that we can get to a stable and safe place for some limited reopening at the very least. And we are starting to see that in Massachusetts and regionally here as well. However, there are many experts caution to be too optimistic about that, because one of the best things that we can do as public servants or students of history or students of civics is look to the past and see what happened in other situations where there were pandemics. And in a previous pandemic, I believe it was the 1918 pandemic, the city of Pittsburgh, or was it Philadelphia? Was it Philadelphia?
Yeah. I thought I read an article about that, a parade or something like that. Or?
Yeah. Well, so I think Philly didn't close, Pittsburgh did. But even though Pittsburgh did, once they started to flatten the curve and they thought it was safe to reopen, they did reopen, and the curve just came right back up and shot back up. And so one of the things that we have to consider is really listening to our public health experts, who should guide us and tell us when exactly we should reopen, even on a limited basis. So that's sort of on the health front of things.
Sure.
On the economic front of things, it's been very difficult for many folks. People who are applying for unemployment, it's expected that about 20% of the population will be unemployed and go on unemployment. And the number right now of unemployment applicants, just as of today, was 24% of the labor market. So the economic impact is very high. And part of our job is to figure out how to best deal with that in the short term, but also in the long term. And so those are really big issues, but also very small issues. For example, a family calling saying, "I need food today," right? And so connecting them to a food pantry or getting food delivered to their home, that sort of thing. So it's been a tremendous economic impact on thousands of families in our region.
Great, thanks for breaking that down. So obviously you've been in my class and civics was the end-all be-all of our class. It was the pulse of my rhythm. And clearly my students are very familiar with a lot of the things in civics, and now how a bill becomes a law at the national and state level, really the timetable has changed if we think about the stimulus bill federally. But I just have a question. You've hinted at it a little bit already, and I think it would be a really cool thing to talk about is, the role of civics during the COVID-19 pandemic crisis. How is the governor, Governor Baker, the executive branch, and the Senate and the House of Representatives, the legislative branch, how are they working together? What have you seen that relationship in terms of what you've had to do, all of you collaboratively, in a short amount of time? Can you talk about that relationship a little bit, please? I find it very interesting.
Sure, absolutely. So there are sort of two buckets that I can think of here. One is that as the governor puts out guidelines, regulations, the stay-at-home order, and set up the parameters to which we were going to ride this pandemic out, the legislature certainly sees ourselves as partners in being able to relay that message down to our community, and making sure that as legislators, as public officials that are actually on the ground in districts, know people on a personal level, that we can actually carry out and implement the guidelines and regulations as set forth by the administration. The other prong, sort of staying this first prong on sort of informal implementation, advice, guidance, as the administration receives funding from the federal government, we in the legislature feel that we have a role to play to be able to strongly advise where that funding goes. Because normally, during normal times, we are the purse, right? The legislature is the purse. And so as this federal money comes in, we want to make sure that we're providing a check on the executive branch here in Massachusetts to ensure that that funding is going to where it's most needed. In the second bucket are legal and policy issues that we need to get done via legislation. And so those are things like the housing and eviction bill that we passed, the MCAS bill that we passed to be able to change the law so that we could waive MCAS. So it's critically important that we stay in close communication with the executive branch and that we find ways to, yes, of course, respectfully disagree, but also act with urgency because this moment does require urgency to support the people of Massachusetts.
Great. So Representative Vargas, could you talk a little bit about what the eviction bill did and what it means and the impact both on people that rent and people who own property? Could you break that down a little bit for my students?
Sure. So the housing and eviction bill essentially says that during the duration of the pandemic, nobody's going to get kicked out of their home unless it is a credible public safety or public health threat. So it does not say, hey, all of rent and mortgage payments are canceled. You don't have to pay anything. That is not what it says. In fact, you're still going to owe your rent at some point down the line. It may be distributed across a set number of months. It may be a lump sum right after the pandemic. Same goes for your mortgage, right? But the idea was that in the middle of a pandemic, we really shouldn't be kicking people out of their homes, whether that's for eviction, if you can't pay your rent, or foreclosure if you can't pay your mortgage, if you own property. No matter if you were a landlord or a homeowner or a tenant, you should be able to stay in your home during a pandemic. And so that is the core part of the legislation, but it is not a reason for people to stop paying rent or stop paying their mortgage if they can afford to. And that's one message that we're really trying to get out to the community, which is, hey, if you don't pay it now, you're going to have to pay it at some point. And so
but don't spend it. Don't spend it, right?
Exactly.
That's a good point. So Representative Vargas, my students, we've been doing this remote learning and it's been going very, very well. My students have been working really, really hard. I think I did send you a clip. I had one of your colleagues, Senator Tarr, on yesterday.
Great guy.
And he had been in the class just like you. And my students are doing a great job. My students also have been very good about giving me advice about what works and what doesn't. And, after the first 3.5 weeks when we were spending time on the, two of them just kind of gently said to me, you know what, Mr. McGravy, this is very important and we love the current events, but could we move on with the curriculum? Could we take a break from the COVID crisis? And so a student suggested your bill, the H720, about the lowering the voting age. And so what I'm doing is, I'm working with Harvard, still with the Democratic Knowledge Project, and we're in the process of doing a shrunken version of writing an editorial. And the topic is your bill, because it really resonated with the students. So what my students are doing right now is they are researching both sides of the bill a lot more thoroughly than when you were with them. Harvard and the library and all these other resources are helping the kids with credible research and getting reliable sites. So if it's okay, I know the voting bill is probably not the priority right now because of what's been going on. And I know it's very important to you. But if you could just briefly discuss, in your opinion as a legislator, where do you think it's at? Do you foresee it coming back in a little bit? And of course, I'm making the assumption that you are still in support of it since you wrote it. So please tell us why you are still in support of it. So just a little update.
Sure.
And then Senator Tarr did talk a little bit about why he's still kind of hesitant about it. And I think it's important that we see both sides of the issue. So if you could touch upon those things, I think my students would really appreciate it as they're doing the research.
Absolutely. And first and foremost, I think it's great that students wanted to sort of get back to the curriculum and focus on other issues, because I think it's so critical and important that you use this time to not get behind on curriculum, not get behind on your learning, because eventually you're going to have to make up that time one way or another. So I think it shows great leadership on the behalf of your students, and we should all be proud of that. You should especially be proud of that, Pat.
Oh, definitely, definitely. Very proud of all of them.
The bill, the Empower Act right now is still in election laws. It received an extension. Normally bills have to be reported out early on in the year, but due to the crisis, it received an extension. It is going to have more time to be reviewed in the committee. That being said, as you and your students probably know, during a crisis like this, the legislature and public servants tend to zero in, as we should, on the challenge before us. And so it is going to be difficult for us to be able to get folks to focus on this issue when, frankly, there are much more urgent issues before us, when there are lives at stake related to the pandemic, when there are people who are under immense economic pressure. It's tough to say, hey, I want to talk about this youth voting bill, when people are lining up virtually to sign up for unemployment. And so that creates a challenge, right? And I think this is one of the interesting parts of civics that I think is the most nuanced and difficult, and probably most exciting to talk about, which is once we understand how government works, how do we engage in a conversation around the politics of how do we get something on the agenda and actually get something done. And so much of what actually occurs in government, in politics, is dependent on externalities and in the moment that we live in, and the political capital that is available to you and the consensus that you're able to build. And I use that word consensus, and I often think about Dr. Martin Luther King, who said, leaders shouldn't just seek consensus, but they mold consensus. And it's something that I think about frequently, but in the middle of a pandemic, it's going to be very difficult for us to get that back on the agenda. But our hope is that once we see this through, we can get back to it and ensure that it stays on folks' radar.
So, Representative, with my students, I always try not to give my opinion. It's really important that students are exposed to both sides of the issue. I think that's what civics is all about. And so my next question for you is not necessarily an opinion, it's an observation. And I'd like you to talk about it a little bit. I find it very interesting that during this pandemic crisis, so much of the working force have become maybe not so much 15, but 16 and 17-year-olds. I've seen a number of people that are working in retail and grocery stores not to save money for college, but to support their families. So I don't know if you've picked up on that, but and I think I know where you're going to go on this, but what do you think that does for the for the voting bill? I mean, what do you think that has?
Yeah, I mean, I think generally speaking, people are realizing how essential what were once called low-skill workers actually are to our society, and how important these essential workers are to our day-to-day operations. And that includes young people in particular. And, we have 3 market baskets here in Haverhill, and they've all got teenagers, right?
Really? I did not know that.
Yeah, we do. And so when I think about the workforce that's out there on the front lines right now, not only for themselves, but to generate some income for their families, I'm sure as well. I think, that could bolster the argument that, look, teenagers are on the front lines even during a pandemic. And we allow them to, drive 3,500 pounds of metal at 65 miles an hour down the highway. And we allow them to be on the front lines of a pandemic. So why don't we let them into a ballot box? What's going to happen?
Great. Thank you. So I got one more issue for you. I know it's so, you're so busy, and I really appreciate you taking the time. So I obviously had Senator Tarr on, and then before that, I had someone who I think the North Andover town manager, Melissa Murphy Rodriguez. You must know Melissa. She came on first, and I think the world of her. I think North Andover is so lucky to have her.
Absolutely.
And what was great is she kind of took over the interview and really wanted to take a moment to reassure the students who maybe have anxiety or stress that she's not saying everything's perfect, but she gave them some comforting words. And Senator Tarr was nice enough to do that yesterday.
Yeah.
So if I could give you an opportunity maybe to possibly give some reassuring words in closing for my students that maybe are feeling stress or anxiety right now, I think that would mean a lot to them.
Absolutely. And thank you, Pat, again, for putting this together. I'm more than happy to participate anytime. To all the students that are tuning in, remember that you live in one of the greatest states in this country and one of the greatest places in the world, I think, personally. Obviously, we're a little biased. And what comes with that is a level of expertise from public health experts, right? We have some of the best medical and academic institutions in the world here in Massachusetts. We have, yes, we have a Republican governor and a Democratic legislature that by and large work very well together to actually get things done. And we're very blessed to have local officials that work collaboratively as well. And you can't say that everywhere else across the world. We are very fortunate here in Massachusetts to have the society that we live in, to have a public that actually complies with social distancing for the most part, and adheres to the guidance that the government puts forward. And so just remember that you're lucky to be in Massachusetts. It's okay to be a little bit nervous, to have anxiety. You're totally normal. But know that we have some of the best people here in Massachusetts working on ensuring that we get through this pandemic and that we come out even stronger. And one of the things as students of history is that you might know is throughout a crisis and after a crisis, a community, a state, a country usually comes out much stronger. And I firmly believe that we're going to do that.
Great. Well, this is definitely at the 25-minute mark, which is great. Representative Vargas, it's been so great to get to know you and have you be involved in this pilot year. I know next year is going to be bigger and better. And these kids that I have this year, I call them trailblazers, which sounds corny, but they are laying the foundation of the civics program.
Yep.
And I know that you're going to be an ally in year 2. And I know my new group of students, when we congregate together in the fall, hopefully you'll be a part of it again. And I really appreciate you being part of this whole journey that we're taking together.
Absolutely. It's my pleasure. And I'm so excited to see what's in store in the future for your students. They're very impressive. And I know that our best days as a community and as a country are ahead when I look at the leadership and the sort of level of social consciousness amongst the next generation of students coming up. And they're very lucky to have a teacher like you to help mold and guide them.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to say goodbye and good night. I'm so sorry about the technical difficulties, audience, but Representative Vargas and I rolled with it. I'm going to stop recording in a moment just to say goodbye to him, and thank you so much.